y yo les voy a hablar de un tema que yo diría que es uno de los temas más interesantes, pero también más complejos del bienestar animal, que es el comportamiento anormal en los cerdos, por qué ocurre y cómo podemos eliminarlo o mitigarlo. Bueno, ¿qué es el comportamiento anormal? Primero les quiero dar una introducción de qué es, algunos ejemplos específicos en cerdos de los comportamientos anormales más importantes y después un poquito acerca del impacto económico y qué cosas podemos hacer para mitigarlo, ¿no? Que también va a servir como una especie de introducción al tema de enriquecimiento ambiental que vamos a tener después del descanso. Así que, ¿qué es comportamiento anormal? Primero, el comportamiento anormal es aquel que difiere del natural. Juliana ya habló extensivamente acerca de qué es el comportamiento natural. Este comportamiento ocurre cuando existen condiciones ambientales óptimas y entonces podemos decir que cuando no hay un ambiente adecuado, empezamos a ver comportamientos que no son adecuados y que son anormales. También sabemos que
an improper environment. We also know that it is related to the affection condition of the animal, such as fear, depression, or frustration. And this abnormal behavior can be a mechanism to cope with environment that are improper, and as I said, and it is also known that abnormal behavior can be also related to an inappropriate functioning of the nervous system. That can be something congenital, but at the same time, that can be due to being for too long in an improper environment, producing neurobiological changes that may or may not be reversible. And finally, there is no an apparent function. And we can also say that abnormal activity and abnormal behavior are normal activities, but they are performed in an abnormal way. That is, that there is a higher frequency and intensity. For example, drinking water is normal, but if we see an animal that takes or drinks too much water, that would become an abnormal behavior. Something to explain a little from where abnormal behavior comes. This is a chart, a motivation chart, a model, and we can see here that there are some variables of the organism. And these variables are, for example, society, temperature, and so on. Then, for example, when there's hunger, that will be a change in this variable, there's a motivation start to appear, motivation for seeking for food, and that leads to appetite behavior. That would be foraging, and what we expect is this leading to the integration of the behavior. That is, the animal being fed, eliminate abnormality, and enter into normal. When there is an abnormal behavior is when this breaks. There not be it's impossible to have a consummation because it's an improper scenario environment. Then they are stuck in the appetite environment. Here, where abnormality is caused, where behaviors, repeated behaviors in several situations, and there are several modes for classification of the abnormal behavior. I will refer to one described by David Frazier. And as you can see, in abnormal classification, many of them are overlapped. And in many cases, they have to do with the one I will refer to, which is the stereotypes. So the first type of abnormal behavior is those self-directed physical manipulation directed to one in frustration, injury, such as the video we are watching now. One other type is directed to others when there is an unsatisfied activity. In this case, activities start to be conducted directed to other individuals in the same group, in our group of peers. In this case, pigs frustrated because they cannot suck more when they are not with the dam. So they start to suck with their conspecifics, and that is also considered abnormal behavior. Empty vacuum activities are those activities without a stimulus present. They are part of something normal, but the stimuli to have that person is not there. And therefore, we can have here the tongue rolling in cattle, what we can see with pigs as well. And this tongue rolling, we know that it's for cows trying to eat forage, to eat it. So there is this rolling in foraging, and it's a repeated behavior. One other type is displacement activities, that is to perform a completely foreign behavior in a given context. You can see that in many times. When you ask a question, instead of answering, you start scratching your head. That is a displacement activity, is displacing from one emotion through a behavior. In the case of this cat, in a case of anxiety, what the cat may do is, to calm himself, is to pass the tongue around his hair. There are some adjunctive activities that will be polyripsia. That activity cannot be done and we do something different. In the case of dams, we know that they have restriction of food, and instead of eating, they drink too much water. And since this is frequently done, it is considered an abnormal behavior. Within abnormal behaviors, we also have stereotypes. They contain all the activities of normal activity. They question induced by frustration, incapacity to cope with the environment, but at the same time, they are repetitive behaviors which do not have a parent function, and we know that in many cases they are linked to some dysfunction of the central nervous system. Then it is classic that if we go to the zoo, we'll see elephants moving from one side to another, same happens at circuses. And as you can see, there is overlap with many of the things I have mentioned before. For example, this tongue rolling can also be considered a stereotype, is a repetitive pattern and constant pattern. It can be related to a dysfunction of the central nervous system. And within all abnormal behaviors, stereotypes, these repetitions are those who get most attention and those most well studied. The abnormal behavior, in the end, is something that is under development, is a complex subject. Within that complexity is the fact that when we think of behavior, we usually think of an activity, but there's also apathy or inactivity, and they can be considered abnormal behaviors. And in many opportunities, we do not consider that as such. This adds complexity to the presentation of abnormal behavior. One more thing that makes it complex is that behavior, abnormal behavior, is classically thought of without having a function. But there's more and more research stating that when this behavior, there is a reduction of stress. For example, this movement of elephants at circuses, what's being studied is that they produce dopamine, uh, reducing the stress. In the case of tongue rolling, there's recent research helping the production of enzymes and things that help digestion. Seemingly, they do not have a function, but seemingly they do. Then they are reducing the level of stress. But it is hugely important to state that even though they are useful to diminish stress, they are presented where there is an inadequate environment. That's really important. It doesn't matter whether they are helping the animal, and somehow they are referring to an environment that's improper and we should solve it. And there's also other uh, incapacities. Some stereotypes can be solvable, where others not. When an animal has been in an improper environment for long and they develop abnormal behavior and stereotype, it is possible that we can solve that inadequate or improper environment, and the animal can reduce stereotypes so they can eliminate it. But if there was a neurological change based on that improper scenario, the animal won't be able to solve a stereotype, but that does not mean that their well-being is not improved. So you gotta be really careful when watching this. I refer a lot up to stereotypes, because within the abnormal behavior, that would be the most important category due to its relevance. And it is known that on a group level, bigger levels of stereotype means that there is bigger well-being. Therefore, and definitely something we have to treat, we have to deal with. And in a psychological sense, we have talked about a phenomenon that I will probably pronounce bad because it's a German word, which is the Zeitgebers, which are what we talked about here is when the animal is under depression, their physiological system is flat and stereotypes, and these abnormal behaviors are useful to produce change and somehow provide the individual a sense of control. Now, with this animal welfare research, this control system and this agency control is pretty important. Then that might be one of the reasons why stereotypes can be produced, because the animal is seeking to have some fixed sense that things may change and the animal can control that. I will refer to some of the stereotypes we can see in pigs. There are several, but I will refer to some of those which are more prevalent and those which are more present in literature. The first one, and I guess that is the one that is more refers to, is tail biting. Tail biting is known that is related to the production of pigs in large units. And this is known because when you see high population, high numbers, when these population rates produce little opportunity for exploration, and when there is a great competency in resources. This behavior is rarely seen in feral conditions, extensive or semi-extensive. Then what is known that it is linked to the extensive production. But at the same time, it is complex behavior and it has a multi-factor origin. We can see that in the chart. Some of the things that may have an influence on tail biting are found here. For example, gender, you know that females bite more, but female present more tail biting than females. And in feed, we know that quality, amount, and type can increase tail biting in case the distribution of grain in food. It's important because if nutrients are not there homogeneously distributed within the animal, between the food the animal is fed on, that can stimulate and encourage tail biting. At the same time, things such as air quality, if there are ammonia of more than 10 particles per million, it is known that that can encourage animals to start tail biting. And genetics, it is landrace is suggested to be at less acceptable. One other abnormal thing that we can see here in pigs is the belly nosing. This belly nosing, what you will see here in the video, this is it, what that piglet is doing there. And that belly nosing is trying to suck in the animal's belly. And it is related to the early weaning. And it's done after some early weaning, after some days. This is a frequency inversely proportional to the age of weaning. If there is a late weaning, there will be less nosing, and there is an early nosing, there will be more nosing. This is why it is related to the weaning age. Other factors are hunger. You can see that when animals are hungry, particularly when animals are weaned and they haven't been accustomed to the food they will receive once they have been weaned. This is where we can see a lot of belly nosing. And also, recent research has evidence that belly nosing has a social motivation. That nosing starts other animal social animals. When the animal is in a foreign environment with other foreign animals, then the nosing will be a way to initiate that social behaviors, and that can behave in an stereotypy when there are a high stress environment such as the weaning, where animals do not know each other, and obviously They want to generate social nexus. And of course, it is known that it helps to cope with frustration in inadequate environment because it's highly linked to cycling. And cycling is such a pleasant experience because it's linked to society, to the mother, to the dam, and trying to imitate this behavior is somehow being in that emotional state of satisfaction and low level of stress. One other abnormal are oral stereotypes now in biting. Well, I'm referring bar biting, sham chewing, and through manipulation. All these things that are related to the handling of the environment through the mouth. What we know about it is that less frequent in, and they increase with parity, but um, it is related to sows in stalls. When these sows are in stalls, these ones in group present something important, and when they are in the area in these gestation stalls, the generation is reduced when it comes to sham chewing. So the space is very important to develop these stereotypes. And I have mentioned food restriction is an important for this house, and it causes a lot of frustration, the lack of society. This is known because there have been some experiments that have received fiber besides the food in animals, for example, like a hay or straw, despite these contentions or what straw is a good enrichment, and it has been seen that when this type of enrichment is provided to them, the oral stereotypes level decreases. Finally, vulva or vulva biting is one of the stereotypes that is more present and it causes more concern. It is known that it is related to electronic software system because these systems, as you well know, have an entry control, and the dominant source are those who like to control entries. And one of the activities or the ways is to bite others. And what best way to bite the vulva, which is the back part we have seen on the picture, cannot immediately respond to that action. It also happens that QE or those when adding QE, if one so wants to move on, what they can do is to move the vulva of the other. So then it is related to group and competence because it is related to it. And it is a frustration, a clear frustration sign. I have referred to all these, but which of these has an economic consequence? Do we have an economic consequence? And the answer is yes. I will use the tail biting as an example for economic consequence because it's what I have studied most. And in the case of tail biting, we know that in several studies, tail biting can reduce the animal growth. It can increase the loss due to carcass condemnation. Then it is rejected due to the amount of the injuries. It increases medical costs. It increases the workload at the farm. And there is a greater risk of health problem and mortality when the tail biting. Apart from this, there are several studies trying to calculate numbers of how much we can lose when we have this tail biting effect. In 2011, the cost of tail bite in a place where you have 1,000 pigs, and out of those, 12% present tail biting, represent 5,000 to 10,000 euros a year. That in 2015 was 3.2 to 6.5 million of Chilean pesos. It should be more because that would be the conversion of 2011. In 2016, you can see that the net cost per pig that needs to be subtracted from the net margin when there is tail biting per pig is of 18.96 euros, you see 14,200 CLP, that should be a bigger amount now, basically subtracted for each peak having this tail biting. If we add to this in a system when there's tail biting, there will probably be other environmental restrictions producing vulva biting, oral stereotypes with other problems. These amounts can also be tripled then there's also something generating economic loss. On the other hand, there's some models where there have been simulations on the following. What happens if we intervene and improve the situation of tail biting? For example, in this chart, in a recent study, what they tried to do is to follow. If we have a barn where there are 32% of animals presenting tail biting, what happens in terms of profit in euros per animal if we reduce it in 80%? And what you can see is that the profit increases to almost 5 euros if we reduce these injuries in 80% than if we reduce it in 20%. Then this can be done through some interventions helping us control tail biting. What type of interventions? For example, the straw, and this number is what will it cost to implement the straw in a system per pig. Then these are 100 grams of straw increasing, that would be 1.67 euros, and this is below the profit we would expect to increase if we take this intervention. And as I said, the straw is contention, that's known because it can block disposal of waste systems. For example, giving pigs more room in system where it is zero in terms of money, but if we have to add it, it might be even 3.72 euro per animal. I am talking in euros because I couldn't make the conversion, but you can have an idea out of it. And interventions such as giving animal toys, that might be 0.13 or 78. There's also other interventions which are cheaper and accessible, such as surveilling the ventilation system, that is 0.35 euros per animal. And as you can see, in a system where there is a 16% prevalence, that is much less than the profit we could make when trying to control the problem. So it is worth. It's something that can add a value to our system if we try to handle that. Now, how to prevent abnormal behavior? We will talk about it later, particularly in enrichment, but I would like to mention what is in the chapter of pigs of the World Organization for Animal Health. In the case of tail biting, what it is recommended is an adequate enrichment, adequate diet, as I'm saying. Some of the things are the level of amino acids, having a good amount of salt in the food, a proper amount of tryptophan, I don't know the pronunciation well. And in the case of the bellinocin, incrementing the weaning age, having the food provision, they will have access after the weaning. In the case of oral stereotype, it is recommended to have provision of environmental enrichment and increasing satiety through fiber content of foraging convenient to us. And in the case of vulva biting, the recommendation is to have a less competition for resources, that is to ensure that all animals can have water and food, and having less fewer animals in the herd. In the end, the messages I would like you to take away are that abnormal behavior are a sign of stress and frustration, and they appear when the animal is unable to satisfy their own motivations. But rather than that, that stereotypes and these abnormal behaviors always appear when there is an inadequate environment. And that would be an information source to us so that we can question what things we can change so that these abnormal behaviors start appearing. And there are some tools such as environmental enriching that we can use to improve our systems. Where I work in Canada, in some places, when some studies, we use these toys, these rubber toys, they love them. Some mats, so they can use the space in a different way. And these things will be seen later in other lectures. But as I say, there are things that are relatively easy to access and they can mark a big difference in our production system in the case of abnormal activities. And this is all. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, I'm here. Thank you. I got two questions here, doctor. Number one is, when there is an abnormal activity being developed, even after the measures you have commented on, such as a space, collective housing, and so on, and this abnormal behavior persists, is it something that it is something such as a learned behavior, a reward system in it provides positive reinforcement you mentioned at the beginning? How do you understand that from your perspective? From my perspective, when we solve environmental problem and stereotypes continue to be developed, there might be a rewarding system physiologically established where which the animal goes to, but it is many times related to the fact that there's already a neurological change in the animal based on experiencing an inadequate scenario for long. The fact that we change the environment and a stereotype does not disappear, it does not mean that the animal is not better. It means that there might be a neurological animal that we cannot solve, but it is imperative we maintain or we change that inadequate environment towards a proper or adequate environment, even when stereotypes cannot be solved or can be partially solved. Very important what you are commenting, because it is something, as you said, is presented frequently, so we need to assess it from an integrated perspective. One other question is, when we refer to providing more space, how much space do you prefer? If we're talking about fattening pigs, what's the proper space you should consider for having the best conditions? A space I recommend, and I guess that this is the European recommendation, is 0.85 square meters per 100 kilograms of animal. That would be the minimum recommendation for a space, so you cannot have abnormal behavior such as stereotypes. I have several questions here, but one of them is the following. Can we go to one of the slides where you talked about the cost when for cost for tail biting? And that would be the last question. The question is, what percentage of frustration or stereotype you have found? Okay, well, in the first example, we are talking about just tail biting, and in this case, there's a prevalence of 12%. So in a barn of 1,000 pigs, 12% present tail biting. And this is how the calculation was made. And below, I'm not really clear about it, but I would, when it comes to the prevalence, but it should be similar because it is more or less what I have seen in most of the studies, between 8 and 16%. The specific example is tail biting. There should be a different prevalence for that type of stereotypes, such as vulva biting or oral stereotypes. Perfect. Very good. Thank you very much.